Hi. This question is really prompted by Relton's talk that was just given, but I think it could be answered by anyone. So, or if all of you have thoughts on it, I'd love to hear it. I'm struck by this idea of thinking about inclusivity, right? And so the longevity within American history. We can trace this back, this sort of national exclusion, all the way back to 1790, right, with the first Naturalization Act that defines citizenship as Anglo descent, right? And you can even move Vince Dred Scott, right? So we see some of these things even occurring prior to this lost cause mythology post Civil War. But one of the things that really struck me, and maybe I'm just late to the game here, and this is a duh moment for everybody else in the room, but I kept thinking about how lost cause is created and perpetuated, and much of that is white women. It's white women, particularly in the South, especially those who join organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, right? So not only are they perpetuating it, they're almost handed it's their job to preserve this memory of this sort of antebellum South. And we could certainly argue that it's outside the South as well. It's a very exclusionary notion. But so I was struck by this idea that here's Lillian Smith, right? This white woman arguing against everything that she's been taught, where she should have almost actually fit into this place of perpetuating these notions and ideas. And so how interesting it is that she doesn't. That's what she's, in many ways, killer's the dream, right? She's fighting with. She's trying to make sense of all of this, of what she's been taught, and then how to sort of rail against it. So I know that's a long way of asking a question, but I'm just curious if that struck all of you as well, or if I'm, again, like a duh. Of course this is what's going on. Phyllis, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, one of the ways that we've heard a lot of different angles on Smith, and partly it's so complicated because of the question of the intersection, but also the complicated interchange between different identity factors, right? Whether it's gender, sexuality, class, race, among other things, but certainly those four, let's say. And that's always a fraught kind of interchange, right, for anybody. But I think one thing that's important to note is that it would be easy, and it has at times been too easy, I think, to act as if they always worked in accord with each other. That, for example, Southern white women were sort of natural allies of African Americans in the South, right? And I think there's storytelling that still, I think about a story like Fried Green Tomatoes, that story, the whole premise of that is that, right? That the white women and the African Americans in the community are thoroughgoing allies against the evil patriarchal dudes. And obviously there are moments in which you can think about that, but generally, that's not the arc of the way the history unfolded, I don't think. And so I think it's right to say that the white community as a whole, not just women, but certainly including women, were perpetuating these narratives in a lot of ways and really working to extend them. And that makes Smith that much more striking for the way that she resists that on all those different levels, gender and sexuality, as well as race and class. So I think that's certainly my take on it too.
I don't know if this is an answer to your question, but as I listened to you, I thought back to the way in which Lillian Smith responded to Pauli Murray in the first or second letter, where they were exchanging, they were kind of setting the stage for the relationship, and Pauli talked about her family, and Lillian Smith wrote about her father, and she talked about how loving he was and how much she adored him. But she also spoke in clear-eyed terms about how exploited his business was. I mean, she talked about she seemed to be able to step back and look at herself and look at the larger situation. So she could say, I love him, I adored him, he was a very good father. But he was he had one of the most exploited businesses in the community that he exploited, and I think she used the phrase starvation. He paid them starvation wages, and they paid very high prices for whatever they bought out of his store. And she talked about how he considered himself a pillar in the church, and he tithed. And that she could see all that. She loved him still, but she had the ability to step back, look at herself, and also do this analysis of what was going on that was not right. So she didn't say she didn't love her father, but she also said that this was a man who in some ways was delusional. She said he was a consecrated Christian, and he didn't really know or recognized how off he really was. And so I think she took that sort of way of looking at the world and applying it in bigger ways in some of these writings. I mean, I don't know if that's an answer, but I thought about that exchange when you raised this question about white women's view of themselves and their perhaps unconscious, or maybe in some ways unconscious and sometimes conscious role in the preservation of myths. She wasn't going to hold on to the myth that Dad was great, even though she said he exploited loved him.
Can just use the wired mic. That one's cutting out for some reason. Just pass that one around. Sorry.
What you're saying about white women in the South makes me think about in Killers when she talks about the white woman on the pedestal. And if they accept the pedestal and this is what women are, this is what we have to do, of course they're gonna sustain the narrative. What else are they gonna do? But Lillian Smith is examining this narrative and going against it. And in Killer, she talks about the white women who started the anti-lynching in the early 1900s. In the Time Life interview that we saw a clip of in the documentary, she goes on to say that these women, could take care of their own chastity and they didn't have to worry about them. They didn't need to be lynching black men. They could take care of themselves. So she names them. She also names in that interview some other folks that are doing good work, women, white and black. But if you are handed this narrative of white supremacy and the lost cause, and you accept it thinking that's your only choice, what else are you going to do except sustain it?
Just in listening to some of the presentations today, I've been thinking about the theme of motherhood in Smith, but also in other writers' works. And maybe it's unfair for me to bring Nella Larson's passing into this and compare Irene Redfield to Alma Dean. But interestingly, Claire in that story doesn't have she has a child and she basically sacrifices her child so she can keep passing as a white woman. But one of the conversations we have in class about that novel is Irene is sort of made to seem like someone who is trading, just like Alma is trading kind of the better qualities of being a human for being secure and having her place in society. She's upper middle class and she wants to keep that. And in some ways, I really can't blame her. I think I'm a mom and I think, well, what do you do? You're going to sacrifice your own children. But I was just thinking about the woman, I don't know her name. I've heard this story on NPR about this work that a woman has been doing in the last 5 years where she's trying to talk about equity in schools. And a remark that she made that really stuck in my head was that she had just decided that if a school was not good enough for her child, it wasn't good enough for any child. And it was this notion that we're responsible for all the children, not just our own children, but for all the children. And if we can make the world good for all the children, then our children benefit too. But I think there's this kind of notion that you're competing for those good things. And women sort of get caught in this spot where it's like they either have to play the game or they have to risk their children. I feel like that's kind of a simplified version of the equation, but I see it happen again and again in plots, And I think sometimes the women in those stories get dumped on a little bit because Alma, like you say, she doesn't have very many choices, but she does have some choices, I think. I mean, I think Lillian is saying we have some choices, and we're copying out if we don't acknowledge that, but I don't know.
I have two issues to put before the panel. First of all, if we want Lillian Smith to come back to the conversation.
Mike's coming.
If we want Lillian Smith to come back into the conversation, she needs to be taught more. And one of the great things about her work is that it's not just literary. There is that, but she was a Renaissance woman, and there's so many other places where she could be taught, and I wonder if you could address that. The second thing is, I think there's a kind of trap for us with Lillian Smith in that it's easy to say she's just talking about the South. I mean, you know, I agree completely with this lost cause argument and so forth, but I'd be interested in Professor Railton maybe talking about the way that nostalgia these days, in the time we're living in, the lost cause is like the 50s, you know, the golden age of whiteness. And it's not just the South, it's people in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and places like that are thinking back to the days when white people had it good in the car factories and things like that. I mean, there's a kind of replication of the lost cause, and I think they're related. So I wonder if you could address those two issues.
Don't want to tie you up here, though. Well, I'll try to talk briefly about that one because I want to hear other thoughts on teaching in particular. But yeah, I mean, I think to me the exclusionary narrative is almost always, in America anyway, where I've thought about it and studied it, deeply tied to, again, a kind of mythic, a nostalgia for a mythic constructed past. And I think, you know, make America great again is only perhaps the most overt phrase, or I want my country back, which was the phrase that kind of preceded it in our last decade of political garbage. But I think there's a really telling column from even before that that really gets at that. And this was after the Virginia Tech mass shooting. Pat Buchanan, one of my least favorite people to start with, wrote a really telling column in 2007 after that shooting, arguing for why diversity was the cause of this kind of collapse. The dark side of diversity is the name of that column of his. And he has this line in there, I'm not going to remember it verbatim, but he says, before 1965, the Immigration Act and other things he's arguing for, we were one people with, and then he lists like a dozen things that we had one of. One heritage, one language, one music. He says, I don't know what the hell one music he thinks we had before 1965. I'm sure it was terrible. But in any case, and that's that myth, right? That's that myth of homogeneity. And yes, it sort of moves for when we apply it, or what particular moment maybe folks are thinking of, partly related to childhood maybe, but also related to kind of whatever our particular moment is. But I think that's a commonality, is that mythic, that embrace of a mythic past, and not just past, but homogeneous past, is central to that exclusionary idea. And I think the lost cause is particularly good for that, because it also failed so spectacularly that it can be mourned maybe even more overtly, because, you know, if only Pickett had gone a different way in 1863 or whatever. But I think more broadly, it's that embrace of a kind of mythic, lost, golden age, homogeneous past that is central to exclusion whenever we see it. And we're definitely seeing a new version of that today with perhaps a different mythic past, but still certainly, I think, the same trend. But happy to hear other thoughts on teaching. Have those or that question.
I mean, I don't teach either, but I just have thoughts. When I was working with Hal in the documentary, I watched a lot of the interviews, and I think I remember George Yancey, the philosophy professor at Emory, saying that he taught Lillian Smith in his courses. That's philosophy, that's not English. And Julia Brock, who was also in the thing, teaches Lillian Smith in history courses. I know at University of West Georgia, they get Lillian Smith in their history courses talking about the South. Diane Roberts teaches Lillian Smith. She was also interviewed. And she's not just English, but journalism. But I mean, the classes I was in, even at Piedmont, the English courses, we didn't get Lillian Smith. The history courses, we didn't get Lillian Smith. The only way I knew about her was through the Scholars Program. She wasn't, I mean, the professors knew who she was, but most of the students had no clue that we even have the center. So there is a need for her to be taught more. And some of that comes in, like what some of us were talking about at lunch, with having some of her works more readily available in better editions of it. Rose and I were talking about The Journey at lunch and how the only versions available lately are really bad. But there's things like The Reader, there's Killers of the Dream and Strange Fruit are fairly readily available. But it's also making sure she's more well known in academia so that professors know about her to teach her. Because a lot of professors have no clue who she is.
Well, I'm not in the classroom anymore. However, I would like to argue that Lillian Smith belongs in book club discussions. Because of our earlier conversations this morning about creativity and spirituality, I dare say Lillian Smith belongs in religious institutions. I could see having really good discussions in some religious institutions using some of her work. I think she belongs in sermons. So I think I'm sure she would have loved to be part of a classroom curriculum, but I also think she would like for us to discuss her work in public places. In many ways, she was, in addition to everything else we've said, she was a public intellectual, and she belongs in public spheres of discourse. So we need her in the classroom, but we need her in public discussion. And as I looked at the letters between her and Pauli Murray, the backdrop of what we're dealing with right now just kept screaming at me. The discussions about her admonitions about demagogues just rang so true to what we're dealing with now. So, and there's small things that I try to do to put her out in the public conversation periodically when I'm tweeting, when something comes up where she has a nice quote that deals with, I'll send that out and say something about, put that quote out, and then I'll always put her dates and who she was. And occasionally I do get direct messages from people asking me, can you recommend that I read what I might read about this author? I've had people, as I was doing, preparing for the premiere that Hal had at the DeKalb Public Library, I posted on Facebook, and I had several friends, older friends, message me and say, I read Killer in college and it was so important to me. I'm glad to hear about this film. I'll go back to Killer again. So we're talking about her in here, but to put it out there in the public discourse, I think is really important.
There's a couple of things that I noticed too when you were talking. One is I saw somebody contacted me in Charleston, South Carolina, at a Christian school. They were using Killers of the Dream as their reader.
Yes.
The other thing that stuck out to me as well is I was up at the camp recording a podcast video with somebody. We had a couple of students from campus up there videoing it. And one of the students, of course, none of them knew who Lillian Smith was, so I had to give the spiel. But one of them was like, I'm from Raven, I know who she was. So even people in the community in the town don't know who she was. And of course, with Carlton, others who come into the community and finding out who she is, because you introduced Carlton to Lillian. And a couple of other things too. The woman who wrote How to Be in, so you want to talk about race, Ijeoma Oluwa. I DM'd her next book, she's using Lillian Smith. So she's using her, the woman who wrote it, I don't remember who wrote it, but White Fragility. There's an epigraph from Pillars of the Dream. So she's recognized and used. I think it's a moment with the backdrop like you're talking about, that it's coming out a little bit more in various ways.
Just add one thing. I don't know how many people in here teach English. Probably I'm the only one. Okay. I was just thinking about how a lot of times you're choosing authors that fit a particular movement or a particular concepts, or like, who would be my representative for the Harlem Renaissance? Who will be my representative for, and I think you don't want to take out Richard Wright and put in Lillian Smith, so that's one of the things I think that makes it difficult to put in a new writer. But whiteness studies, I think, does make this an interesting conversation. You don't want to have Lillian Smith speaking about segregation to the exclusion of some of the really great Black writers that were talking about it. But the perspective, I think, does bring something new to the conversation if she is talking about what it means to be a white person as part of that equation. So I don't know, I'm kind of getting excited about how I can integrate her into my American Lit course.
Because I think the question was, how do we include her more so in education? And I'm in nursing and public health. And I'm seeing here what attracted me more so to this symposium was the social change initiatives. And I think from that forum, I could take it back to my public health platform and incorporate her into my community health initiatives so that I can have my students really think of the social determinants that we have in our community, using her own frame of mind and her thoughts process to be able to impact the health of the community. So I can see how you can use her thought process, her philosophies, not only in the literature, in a history, in spirituality, because as we approach social change, she is indeed an instrument of social change.
We haven't shown the film to predominantly African American audiences yet, but we're planning to in Atlanta. But a couple of comments I received from a couple of African Americans in Jasper was very revealing to me, because they had never heard a white person say the things that Lillian Smith was saying. And it sort of opened them up to the fact that white people could see the truth behind things. So that was a powerful moment for me, and I'm looking forward to sharing it, with more diverse audiences too.
When President Obama gave the eulogy in Charleston, he challenged people to do something. And a friend of ours in Rabun County, where I live, took that very seriously and decided to take on an issue that there are 159 counties in Georgia, and there are 2 that fly the Confederate flag on the courthouse property, and Rabun County is one of them. And it's so ironic, Professor Rattleton, that you talked, because I've been thinking about this all day, this cause thing, because he brought it up, he brought it before the county commissioners. It was the largest attended meeting I think they'd ever had. It was standing room only. The hostility in the room was extremely palpable. Some people thought something would happen. Someone had parked a hearse out in the very front of the courthouse with the largest Confederate flag on it you have ever homemade, almost as wide as your stage. Very rowdy group, majority people who wanted to save the flag. And it was, almost beyond my belief that the feelings ran that deep and that strong. And of course, the council voted in their favor. And so we still fly that flag. So we have a lot of work to do just in Raven County. Matthew stole my punchline. A lot of little towns in North Georgia will say home of Billy Ray, their famous member, and we ought to say we're the home of Lillian Smith, or have a billboard, or we need to do something, because people there need to hear her message more than anybody, or as much.
And just one quick thought on that. And obviously, again, there are specifically Southern sides to this for sure. But I mean, there are a number in Massachusetts right now. There are a number of houses that have Confederate flags up or painted on the side, cars that I see with them. And so it, to me, has become just, again, a sign of not only the nationalization of that symbol, but of the kind of representation of this larger kind of exclusionary narrative and mythic vision of the past and the present in America. I mean, it's hard to know where to start with that in some ways, right? Where to start with a New Hampshire barn with a Confederate flag on the side. It sort of makes your head explode. But on the other hand, I think it makes it that much easier then, or at least more important than, to push beyond even any conversation about it being about Southern heritage or heritage not hate or whatever. It's a symbol of these narratives. It's a symbol of these exclusions. Even leaving aside what the war actually included and was about, just in the present, it is a symbol of that, fully. And that's the only way you could fly it in Massachusetts and have it make any sense at all, is that it's a symbol of those narratives that again, Smith even more potently is taking apart, right? Not just the Southern version, but the national version, the human version, the collective version. So I think Massachusetts kind of lays bare how much broader that is than even just the particular counties. Well, of course, that's still a local issue for sure, too.
There's two things I want to add to that. Number one, you talking about Massachusetts, the Confederate flag, they're flown in Norway. So you'll see trucks with them, typically in the rural areas, they're in Norway. But one thing when you were talking reminded me of one of my favorite books from Smith, actually from The Journey, with the opening, which a book that doesn't focus on race, of course, as much as the other books do, but her opening to that, which is on the slides, is this. Let me scroll back down to it. There it is. There's no going alone on a journey. Whether one explores strange lands or Main Street or one's own backyard, always invisible traveling companions are close by. The giants and pygmies of memory, that nostalgia, she doesn't use that word, a belief pulling you this way and that, not letting you see the world life-size and insisting that you measure it by their own height and weight. So even in that book where she's dealing with her medical issues and her search for herself and other things, she's talking about those things we carry with us, those giants and pygmies that we struggle with.
I'm glad you brought us back to the journey, but also ties in when I think about where and when Lillian Smith was writing, and how important both in her work in the camp as well as with what she was writing was her sense of global inclusion. And as you were exploring inclusion and exclusion in American history being part of our history, part of who we are. But it strikes me we just, we can fight so much on these look at these local examples, but we really are paused and poised at a global crisis. And I think Lillian Smith was very much there, especially when I think of how she talked with the campers at the end of World War, after the dropping of the bomb in Japan, and how they talked about what it meant that was happening, and how we can't live in a world. We can't live in a world like that. She's talking globally in a world, and she, perhaps because of her experiences through her family and her own experience in China, she she always thought globally as well as locally. And I think we simply have to. I mean, which way are we going in the world? But these pulls between exclusion and inclusion are the defining pulls of the future of the earth and humankind. So thank you for grabbing them like that and our attention.
Thank you.
I think it's interesting how relevant Lillian Smith is today. Also think about how sad it is that she's relevant today. Because what Lillian Smith was optimistic about is that if we would reach this point where, like this tipping point, then, maybe we can become more inclusive. But you know what? We've reached those tipping points before. It's like we stretch the rubber band, and the rubber band keeps coming back into place, which says to me, and you might be able to speak to this, Real, that the power of exclusive identity is much greater than the power of inclusive identity. That we've gone through the civil rights movement, and we thought that we thought that we were making progress. But here we are in 2019, and we're as much of a reflection of almost the Jim Crow era as we've ever been, in some ways. We're headed down that same road. Can you respond?
And I'm an optimist. I'm a critical optimist, but an optimist. I think like Smith, and so I can't disagree with anything that you're saying in a lot of ways. But the thing that I try to come back to, and that I come back to in this book, for example, like the chapters are usually say like 2 or 3 pages on the exclusionary histories, and then 15 or so pages on models of inclusion, figures, communities, moments, histories, and that's partly just my own bias. Again, I'm an optimist, but I think what does distinguish, and again, I'm an Americanist, so I'm biased that way too, but I think what does distinguish America, or at least is specific and particular about America, is that we have models of the inclusion throughout. So the way that I would frame it, while entirely agreeing that we have not been able to move consistently, or even perhaps at all, collectively toward inclusion in the ways that we could have perhaps, is that we have models of that throughout our history, even at the darkest moments, the most divisive moments, the most exclusionary moments. We have models of inclusiveness, again, in voices and figures and texts, in stories. And so to me, I guess the point of that would be we have the possibility, maybe the ability, definitely the possibility of learning from those models and getting it right. Maybe eventually. We're not there right now, God knows. It's really hard to stay an optimist in 2019, I promise. But I do think we have those models, and I think, in fact, we often have forgotten them, right? There's a reason to me, there's lots of reasons why Smith has been forgotten, including certainly gender and sexuality and many other factors. But I think one of them is that we even when we remember the dark histories, we tend to just remember them, right? So we remember a little bit now the Trail of Tears, but not the many Native American voices who argued against that in that era, who argued for their own community and for a national community that in the era of the Union movement. We definitely don't remember them at all, even when we remember the Trail of Tears. And I think we definitely don't remember the Lillian Smiths either. So I think the more we can remember the inclusive figures and models and texts and stories and histories, the better chance we'll have of moving forward in that direction. Well, there's no guarantee.
Yeah, I would say that that the term "we" is contested.
Oh, sure, that's my point.
I think it's contested. Who are the we that want to use those models for inclusion? We just had, I'm sure that everybody knows this and saw it in the news. We just had Major League Baseball umpire the other night.
It's going to be a civil war.
Civil war. I'm
CIV,
going to get an AK-47. We're going to have. These are the signs of the times, and is that a we?
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
I do.
So I think that the rubber band, I go back to my metaphor of the rubber band. We keep stretching and making progress, but for some reason that we don't understand it keeps blowing back. And I think we need to explore that. The we that want to and should, we should explore why that is. Why we keep going forward, but yet keep coming back.
Yeah, in my paper that's going to be in the critical essays, I talk a lot about trauma and the large-scale societal trauma that comes with this ingrained racism and othering that's true in a lot of societies around the world. And whenever you're trying to heal from trauma, it's not linear, it's not even cyclical. It goes forward and back, it's very difficult, it's very painful. And a lot of times progress doesn't look like progress. But again, like Ben, I'm an optimist, and in this day and age, it's hard to live a life if you're not. I mean, what makes it worth it if you're not optimistic? I mean, I'm young. Most of my memories, I grew up mostly in post 9/11. I had active shooter drills growing up in school, and I'm still optimistic. And I'm surprised at Lillian Smith's optimism, even though I'm optimistic with our current situation. Because in many ways, she was living in much harder times. I mean, our current issues are a lot the same issues in different clothing. There are legal things in place, but not societal things. We haven't changed as a society very much. But I think it all goes back to community and being inclusive and developing communities where people can be honest and open with each other and the struggles that they've been through and be able to talk with one another about these issues.
I just had to hug her because I could hear Lillian Smith speaking through her as she spoke, and I'm old enough to be probably your grandmother. And to hear you speak like that and to know that from what we've learned about the values and attitudes of the millennials and Generation Zs, I guess is what they call them, they're much more liberal than, they're the most liberal generation coming on. So despite what we're dealing with in the political arena, there's still hope there. They have grown up with these coming two generations have grown up with much more accepting attitudes about all the issues that seem to be points of major confrontation in this current generation, whether it's race or sex or sexuality. The millennials they're accepting, they're comfortable. They even President Obama said his daughters moved him. They helped him. You know, he was a little, I wonder if what's going to happen in terms of if the country's ready to move. And his daughters, he said, they were having dinner and the daughters wanted to know, what's the deal? So this young woman makes me hopeful.
Well, weren't we like that in the 60s and 70s?
I don't know. I mean, I think,
And you made a difference.
yeah.
And you made a difference.
Yeah, it did make a
In the
difference.
60s.
We did. Look where we are now.
Well, no, it's not.
And that's my point, is that
Yeah.
we don't understand why we go,
Right,
why we stretch the band, and all of a sudden,
right.
at some point, it bounces back.
But if while I'm listening, I'm hearing what you're talking about. We're stretching the band and then we come. But I'm sitting now here thinking that, yes, we are even stronger now than then, because if we were trying to figure out who are the we are the Lillian Smith right here. If we count so many voices of the Lillian Smith, we are the Lillian Smith. So if each and every one of us take it to the next level, to another group of folks, and we share the word, that's the voice of the Lillian Smith that is being here. I didn't know about William Smith. I saw Lillian Smith on a poster on the wall. That's what got my attention. So yes, the we, that collective we is still building up. So I'm hopeful and I'm really insightful in the fact that yes, the we who you were asking, who are the we are the we.
And I was gonna add to that, the other thing, I told you about talking to Sarah. She knew Lillian for 4 weeks. That was it. And the impact that Lillian had on her was amazing with that. And taken even further back, the effect that Anna Lori, her sister, had on the children of Esther. I mean, her whole family. I mean, Rose could tell you, Sue Ellen could tell you, the effect that the whole family had on all of these individuals at different spots and different moments in their lives has permeated out. So there's a couple of things I thought about. I understand the metaphor of the band, so when does it break eventually? But also, the metaphor I keep going back to is the roots that are dug underneath that trembling earth. And not sort of the swampy earth, but oak trees being from South Louisiana, or living in South Louisiana, and in North Louisiana, I guess too. But the roots just digging deep and not succumbing anywhere. Ernest Gaines has a good story, just like a tree, about a woman moving from the quarters to the north. She dies before she moves. But one of the most powerful passages is the uprooting of the tree. And it's an uprooting of her moving from home, and the taproot remains, so she remains at home. So it's a little bit different. But just that image of the roots. The fact that they're so deep, and I think that the roots are so deep with these fears that you mentioned. How do we disentangle them? And like you said, it's through things like this. Through reflecting on ourselves, through education with others, through introducing people to these ideas and having them look at themselves. I think back too to that quote from The Journey, because we carry the pygmies and the giants with us. I carry them with me. I've had to deal with it. I'm sure most of us in this room have had to deal with it in some way, shape, or form. We have time for probably 1 or 2 more questions.
Well, I'm just thinking about George's question. I've been having a similar question because I've been reading some things about community, and at least some experts are talking about what is fundamental for what humans sort of require in terms of community and identity. And I think you're hitting on something there where we sometimes, if we are uncertain about our identity in relation to a group or a whatever it is we identify ourselves by, I think we become kind of irrational. And I mean, so this tribalism that we see, I think lots of us in the room look around and we're like, what in the world is going on? Why are people acting like this? And it's so hard to understand it that I think we really can't empathize. I mean, I found myself just thinking, I just can't understand it well enough to even address it, you know? But I think there's something fundamental happening there. People sort of feeling threatened at their very roots. But I was thinking about the rhetoric that Smith uses. It's really interesting because she does attack people sometimes. I mean, she doesn't pull any punches like people have said, but she comes at the problem kind of through herself. So like when she's in Killers of the Dream, she's not analyzing everyone else, she's analyzing herself, and she becomes symbolic of everyone else. So right now we're so polarized, it's almost like I can't bridge that chasm between me and the other side, but I think she was really working hard to get into that middle space. And I would need to do a lot more looking at her to see how in the world she was doing that. And I'm not sure how much she was really getting across to the other side. Maybe it was, other liberals that were reading her stuff. I don't know. But I think, like, especially in Now Is the Time, I think it's really interesting because she seemed to be saying, look, I know you're scared. You're worried you're going to go to church tomorrow and there's going to be somebody sitting in your pew that you've never seen before. And she says, you know what's going to happen? Nothing's going to happen. You're going to be okay. The church isn't going to blow up. Things are going to go on the way they have been going. And it seems like she's so sympathetic about what people's fears are that maybe she sort of bridges that gap just a little bit. But I don't know that I have, any good answers about how we can bridge some of our chasms.
So these thoughts are hot off the press right here. But I'm thinking that the roots are really, sort of institutionalized racism and institutionalized misogyny, and that, I think that the 60s did a whole lot to address that, but maybe more on a interpersonal level, as far as my experience in the South, coming up in the 70s. I think that there was a lot less interpersonal racism that I was, my experience, I was, anyway, I'm not going to go into that, but it does seem like the Lillian was able to look at herself, deal with the contradictions that she saw in her family and probably in herself, and that she pushed the campers to also deal with, maybe to the point that they couldn't, but that they did, and you have some really good stories about how they actually dealt with those contradictions and didn't realize that they were dealing with it, but that how to model after Lillian and looking at the ways that she kept pushing to deal with the truth but to, she wanted to be an artist more than an activist, but she was an activist, and how to take it more into activism right now, because we are in a crisis state, and look at those roots and to vote for sure, but to also address in the ways that we can those institutional systems that are and create an earthquake and knock those trees over. And anyway, so I'm not exactly sure what I'm saying, but that's what was kind of coming to mind. I just wanted to voice that we need to look at the institutional levels as well as the personal.
One of the things that I wish could have been the case for Lillian Smith as well as Pauli Murray, because they were path-breaking pioneers out there setting precedent, is for them to have had more support. It was very lonely for both of them doing the kind of work that they were doing. So I know that everybody can't do that kind of work. And when I look at in those two cases, and even I would throw Eleanor in the pool with them, I don't have the kind of energy those women had. I mean, the activism, but also the incredible intellectual work. I mean, the kind of thinking that Lillian Smith did, and the time that it took, and the skill it took to do the kind of writing she did, was just almost overwhelming when I would read about what she was doing and what she was thinking and sharing with Pauli Murray. And for those of us who happen to know people in this lifetime who have those kinds of abilities and who can do that kind of work, at the very least, what we can do is support them, however that is, whether that is periodic reaching out to tell them how much we appreciate them. I wish that Lillian Smith did not have to deal with the financial worries that she had most of her life. The same is true of Pauli Murray. If we're in a situation to offer them those kinds of people solace, or some kind of financial support, or help in some other way, do that, because their contributions will be long lasting. But Lillian and Paulie worried all the time about money and got very little support in terms of the work they were doing as writers. So if we're in a position to encourage an editor or someone to take a look at the writing of someone we think is really doing groundbreaking work, do that. Get that. Try to do what you can to get it on the desk of an editor or someone, a publisher or an editor who might be helpful, or encourage them to submit it to a blog or someplace so that they can get exposure. I want to believe it would be easier for Lillian and Paula Murray now that we have all these social media outlets available. But often people doing the work don't even know about those. So it's helpful to think about ways in which we can support people who are breaking new ground and don't have time because they're doing the work to spread the word.
How I might be able to identify with her in that.
I just wanted to speak a little bit to that. I think we need, in general, more focus on the humanities. There's a reason why they're called humanities. They help us. I mean, one of the things I love about literature is it shows how human we are and what kind of people exist, and help both broaden the idea of humanity as well as it also shows me how similar everyone is. Taking a South African literature course right now, and the problems are the same problems. They are human problems. And that's what history shows us, literature, philosophy, other humanities. And there's been a lot of cut in funding lately, so a lot of these courses aren't being taken as seriously in the arts as well as outlets for creativity. And I think if we were able to push that some more and let people process what's going on in their lives creatively or intellectually and have that space to talk about it, I think that would also help. I mean, and on a large scale level.
That's why Hal's new project, looking at people who have taught in prisons, human literature and that kind of thing is important.
I've been relating, Pat, to what you said about social media. I think if Lillian Smith were here today, she would be all over social media. And I'm wondering if there's such a thing as a deceased person having a Twitter handle. And I think the Lillian Smith Center should be sure to do that.
There are.
And get the word out.
Absolutely.
That sounds like something that like a student intern could do.
It's like a quote a day.
Do you know anybody?
Add some more people to the scholars program first and have them do it as a portfolio activity.
Well, I am going to have them do the videos. So we do have the Twitter handle, and I do post threads and stuff. Like I said, it's LES_center if you want to follow it. And we do have Facebook. I'm trying to boost the Twitter followers. I started an Instagram. I don't know how well that's going to go. I'm not huge into Instagram. So if anybody wants to help with that, you can let me know. But we do have one, and hopefully that's going. But going back, before we wrap up, to what Emily said about the humanities, one of the things we were talking about earlier, of course, is I've had students, I'm not in the sciences, I started off in biology education, but there's research on doctors and nurses. The more they read, the more they connect through literature other voices that are not their own, the more empathy they feel and the better they become as physicians and nurses and caregivers. So there's scientific research into that and the ways that the humanities and letters and literature, art, and all these other things open up our worldview and help us to break that down. So I thank you for coming. We'll be around for a little bit longer if you want to talk. If you want to learn more about the center, there's information in your folders. There's also my business card in there as well. And there are still some books for sale out there. Thank you to our presenters. And